It's calling me. I hope that's a lead. Can you look at the stream and see if we're indeed streaming? I'll start typing out the news.
Yeah.
Testing, testing.
I hear you.
Yeah, we're streaming.
Excellent. Okay, I'm gonna put this on the unless I do this. One more time. 1, 2, 3, check.
1, 2, 3, check.
We'll do it live.
Okay. No.
We'll do it live. Fuck it. Do it live. I'll write it and we'll do it live.
Hello, this is Dylan Moore and Nima Major of Irida TV coming to you today. It is May 12th. I don't even know what day it is. It's Friday, 2023, and we are here doing it live. And we're going to talk about some stuff a topic that is very fond to our hearts, and we're going to attempt to recombobulate some delirious economic jargon. Does that sound interesting? At least we think it is. If you get frustrated trying to make sense of economic nonsense in the world, like we do too, join the club. We're going to see if we can make some sort of sense of it that is something other than this thing all good or that thing all bad. So Nima, particularly in the light of we've got the hiking of the interest rates, we got some banks failing. We Peter Schiff is strangely predicting that everything is going to crash. I mean, he only does that every once in a while, so we know something's up. I mean, I think a better predictor at this point of what's going on is, looking at Paul Krugman and taking whatever the opposite of he says. But you were looking through your economic library recently, and you came up with an idea that sounds worth bringing up because it may give us a little bit more insight as to what's actually going on versus the mainstream narrative of how things work. So Nima, what did you find?
Well, I was reminded of Minsky's, particular this book called Why Minsky Matters, which is more like a... Okay, they're censoring it. It's not allowed. It's forbidden.
there it is. Yeah.
It's like a summary of Minsky's writings written by Randall Wray. And in regards to these interest rate hikes that are going on right now, keep banks from lending and discourage risky lending and bring everything back to earth and make everyone more reasonable, etc. Number one, obviously raising interest rates increases the net subsidy paid by the government to the private sector, which is not anti-inflationary, even just in pure mathematical theory. But also, we haven't seen a drop-off in bank lending since these interest hikes have begun. We have seen 2 banks shut down so far, 2 or 3, I guess 2 actually, SVB and First Republic Bank. And I couldn't find the exact paragraph in Minsky's book, so I'm just going to paraphrase the idea, or maybe it's not even, maybe it's my idea. Let's just call it my idea. We went through the First Republic balance sheet on our last call, and you could see that basically their profit calculation so it began collapsing. It didn't add up anymore because short-term funding has become more expensive. Getting the reserves that they need to facilitate clearing, especially in the case of deposit drains, have become more expensive for the banks.
And I think it's worth emphasizing that they were having this problem despite the fact that they were doing better and better and better year over year from a purely, okay, how are we doing in terms of selling our product and doing business? Like it was increasing and they were doing a good job, but things got so expensive it canceled that out.
Right. They have their interest income has actually gone up, and we discussed on our last call how impressive that actually is, that I mean, just from a layman's perspective, if given that their cost of funding has gone up so much, they've still been able to generate a profit. Actually, they've still had a positive net interest margin. But what has happened, regardless, especially after First Republic's quarterly report, is that their cost has gone up and up and up to where at this point it may be eating up their revenue, and that's just too expensive to sustain if you don't have cheap checking account deposits providing reserves. Those deposits have gone over to JP Morgan, and JP Morgan is taking over their loans. So JP Morgan will be able to service these loans just perfectly fine for now. And also, JP Morgan will be able to make more loans. There's nothing stopping the banking system in aggregate from making more loans. And in fact, I would argue that if your funding source becomes more expensive as a bank, if the interest rate keeps on going up and up and up, that's just going to think about it from any banker's perspective, right? The bank has a cost side of their balance sheet, and on their asset side, they now need to accumulate higher interest generating assets. So they need to make higher interest generating loans. So I would think this actually encourages banks to look for riskier and riskier credit risks, to make riskier and riskier loans, to where the profit calculation starts working out again. So whereas previously they would focus on making mortgage loans at 3%, 4% with good collateral, now they have to pay about 4% on the cost side. So now why not start looking for 9%, 10%, 11% loans to risky ventures, to, ventures that promise a big return in the future, but that may also fail. But I think this raising of interest rates that's going on right now, it may actually encourage more risky lending than was the case with lower interest rates. So that's kind of the exact opposite of the official narrative, which is that raising interest rates is going to discourage from lending and make banks more prudent.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's exactly what I want to unpack here. So to your point, the official narrative is if we raise interest rates, that makes money more expensive for people to borrow it. So, for example, starting a business or refinancing something or buying a house or buying a car or whatever, it makes it more expensive. So, therefore, it should discourage the generation of new loans, which should help contract the amount of money in the system, which should be, in effect, deflationary. Now, that completely overlooks the fact of, as we've discussed here, if you have any understanding in MMT, that if you raise the interest rates, that means the bonds pay out more, the U.S. Treasury bills, and that that's a net injection into the private sector. And the initial question is, well, does the brakes on the loan creation end up being more than the gas in the injection from the Treasury bonds? And typically we see that the answer is no. And in the case specifically that you just brought up, since we've started raising these interest rates, loans have gone up. The loans haven't slowed down at all. So loans have continued to go up. Whether or not that's due to interest rates is debatable. But what's not debatable is that the injection of money from bonds has increased. So on both sides of the equation, since these interest rates have gone up, you're pointing out that the amount of money has increased. And now, if I'm understanding this correctly, you're saying, okay, as the interest rates go up, I, as the bank, have to pay more money for getting the money for me to loan out. So in order for me to make up the difference, I might want to say...
not necessarily to loan out, but to have the reserves.
Yeah, thank you.
If you get the deposit drains, in that particular scenario, then you need to make...
Actually, let's add the deposit drains in here, because that was a critical component of what we were talking about last time, right? Is that right now, while the Federal Reserve is cranking up the interest rates, it's simultaneously offering this. I forgot specifically what it was called, the reverse buyback something fund or whatever it is. Where
Reverse
they say,
repo.
yeah, the reverse repo, which is to say, hey, individual or business, if you park your money at the Federal Reserve, we will pay, more than the savings account or the checking account that you have it in, which, I mean, is great for you or me who might want to make a little bit more money. But if the bank needs those reserves handy in order to, clear accounts at the end of the day or at the end of the week, and those reserves are getting removed en masse out of the system, I mean, we talked about this last time, is like it's kind of like a game of musical chairs. At some point, there's going to be a loser. There's not going to be enough for everyone to go around, right?
Yeah, and let's look at this chart just
pop it up.
Just to stress that the importance and the magnitude of what's been going on recently. Let me pull this up here. Okay, boom. Okay, so this is what we talked about on our last call. This is what's called the Federal Reserve's overnight reverse repurchase agreements, Treasury securities sold by the Fed. In other words, it's a savings account that the Fed offers that's outside of the banking system that money market mutual funds take advantage of, and this is where a lot of deposits have been going to. And just look at these numbers here. I mean, I just pulled up a chart over several decades here,
which includes the 2008 debacle.
It includes 2008. We see a little blip here. Oh my God, 25. What's this? $25 billion in 2008. That money went into this facility. Then we had a little bit again here, 2014.
And that little bit looks huge compared to 2008. Yes.
Right. And then it dropped down again here. This is like, Trump years, peaked up during COVID, in the beginnings of COVID, a little bit here, but it was a big deal back then. But then now, as of March 21, it's just gone absolutely off the charts. This is $2.4 trillion approximately now. And it may have peaked, that might be good news here, maybe, but this is the money that's leaving the banking system in aggregate.
The reserves that are leaving the banking system.
The reserves are leaving the banking system in amounts that are absolutely unprecedented. And this is part of the Federal Reserve's interest rate policy, right? Because you offer a higher interest rate outside of the banking system. People go there and you force the banks to raise the interest rate on their savings, on their CDs, etc., to bring those deposits back. So this is an aggregate trend that's affecting the overall banking system. And like you said, it's kind of like a game of musical chairs. Deposits leave this bank, go to some other bank, but then from the other bank, they go here. At the end of the day, a lot of deposits have been sucked out of the banking system and have gone into this facility right here. And it's also along the lines of what we read from an article last time from the New York Times discussing this kind of thing. I think they started talking about it in 2022, towards the end of 2022, that this has absolutely put a lot of banks in a bind, because this raises their cost of funds. And in many cases, given that during this period here, very cheap, very low interest loans were made, they are now no longer profitable under these circumstances, or close to not being profitable under these circumstances.
Right. Well, and then I guess the correct word is liquidity, right? This is just sucking liquidity out of the system that the banks need just to, I mean, any business needs a certain amount of liquidity for payroll or whatever, but a bank specifically, because they're the ones moving deposits around back and forth with each other. If there isn't enough liquidity at the end of the day to make all these transactions happen, then yeah, someone's gonna lose out. And if we combine that with the rising interest rates, which is to say, okay, it's costing us more to have this liquidity, right? We have to pay more to attract it from depositors, or we have to pay more if we go to the Federal Reserve to pull out a credit line. It's kind of a double whammy. But to your initial point is what you're suggesting is looking at all of this. This might actually be a reason for the bank to go, look, we got to start making some more money, or this isn't going to work. So if we're able to put up with 10% risk as of yesterday, maybe we need to start putting up with 15 or 20% risk as of tomorrow in order to attract, 1 or 2 extra points of interest rate on our loans.
Yeah, I think this makes certain segments of the lending market unattractive and encourages banks to reprioritize riskier venues of lending. We have some questions coming in.
Oh, cool.
Hi, Ronora. Could this be setting up for another credit expansion cycle?
What do you mean by credit expansion cycle?
Well, expanding, I assume expanding credit is this expanding amount of aggregate loans in the private sector. Well, I think we are still in a credit expansion cycle. So I wouldn't say setting up another one. I think we are still in one.
Well, and then Roanoa, are you specifically referring to setting up a credit expansion cycle that will eventually pop? Is that what you're referring to? We'll see if the person comes back. But if that's the case, the argument that Nima and I make is that you can have credit expansion that doesn't necessarily have to pop as long as the federal government spending is giving enough private sector net savings to the private sector to cover the debt service that's created by that credit expansion. I mean, would you put that differently, Nima?
That's exactly it. Yeah. So as long as the incomes are there and the incomes are generated, profits are generated out of deficit spending, investment spending, export surpluses. We don't have export surpluses in the U.S., so a cyclical private credit expansion is what Ronora is referring to. Well, let's have a look at. Let's just do this on the fly. Let's have a look at current credit stats. Okay, so this is my own dashboard here where I have some quick links on the Federal Reserve St. Louis's website. I was just looking for private debt, total private debt. Let's look at this one.
Yeah, I mean, that's a steady increase.
Yeah, so we have we had a contraction of a very long credit cycle, obviously in 2008, and it only started reversing sort of towards 2012. Okay, so we have been in a cyclical credit expansion in absolute terms, and also what's an important number to look at is the private debt to income. And that has been pretty subdued still, as you can see. I wouldn't really.
Yeah, that doesn't count. That's when all the PPP loans were going out, while simultaneoly everybody was staying at home at work.
And if you look at a big picture, okay, we had this peak of about 280, 290%, almost 300% loans to income in the private sector, and that number has shrunk and has bottomed out, and is still at this level, which is 224% right now. We have this brief peak during COVID, but as Dylan just pointed out, we don't really think that this number is relevant because a lot of these loans were forgiven afterwards, and as we can see, it all went back down to previous levels here. But we are at a certain level that has existed before, that has been sustainable before. I mean, yes, it has been lower before. I mean, leverage has gone up and up and up over time, but it's not really, we can't say that there's a correct a leverage.
Amount. Yes.
Right. This is a relative number. So I'm kind of surprised that it's such a steady increase. That obviously reflects a long cycle of um, of risk taking, of risk proclivity. Is that the right word?
Well, and then don't forget you have
risk averseness.
you have population increasing throughout this too, right? From 1950 to 2010, there's a population increase that goes along with this. So,
But but this is a relative number. This is loans to income. You know, so yeah, you may have population increase, but this is an average
I see.
figure. So I do think it reflects. I mean, we talked about how Peter Zehan describes this as the period of easy credit, hyperfinancialization, etc. But it did peak out in Q4 of 2009, and it has been at this sort of
pretty steady,
stable level, yeah, pretty steady for quite a while. So while we've seen,
I wonder. Sorry to interrupt. I wonder, because one thing I'm thinking about is, because I'm trying to visualize how could you have this substantial increase, because if we go back to 1955 and we're at what, 60 to 1, and then let's bring it to the stabilization now, which we're at 230 to 1, that's basically 4 times increase from the 50s. How can you do that? Two things that pop into my head is a change in culture, which would be, I'm more interested in purchasing my house than I am in saving the money. Also, I'm wondering how much of it has to do with the increase in terms on loans. What I mean by that is, let me focus on mortgages here for a second. In 1955, was it normal for someone to get a 30-year loan on a mortgage? Probably not. I think the 30-year loan on the mortgage is relatively new in this time frame here. I think back then it was more like 10 or 15 years. Well, when you increase the term on the loan, you could get bigger and bigger loans because your monthly payment gets lower when you increase the length of the loan. So I wonder if the culture of having loans last longer and longer and longer has anything to do with this chart as well.
Right. And maybe also the increase in, I don't know if the increase in productivity plays a role in this chart, because over time, the productivity of a capitalist economy improves. What about real wages? They peaked in the early 70s. Real wages peaked in the early 70s.
I think she's here, Ronora. I still don't know if you're male or female. Looks like a female name, but don't know. I think what's being referred to here is wages increasing versus inflation increasing.
Yeah, for sure. No, and this is but meaning a greater need for credit. Yeah.
Yeah.
Could be just be there's more demand, and there's more willing and able borrowers to make loans. That could not my real name. Yeah, that could be totally reflected in this chart. Now, if you say wages, that does not include other means of income that exist in society, right? So a loan officer is not going to make a loan just based on someone's wages, but also based on profit income, interest income,
investment income. Yeah.
Investment income. So while real wages have declined since the 70s, also 70s, that's when we started having a period of high inflation because of the oil price embargo and the wars in the Middle East. So we had a pretty big price shock as far as inflation is concerned in the US and other countries as well. And a rich man only needs so many homes.
Lies. He always needs more.
But yeah, I think it's true. Like, at one point it gets burdensome. So, like what's his name?
Bernie Sanders.
Cuban American rapper.
Oh fuck, I don't know.
Mr. 305. Can't believe. Pitbull. Pitbull has, I think, 10 different wives and 10 different homes. And I just imagine, and probably the same amount of mistresses and girlfriends. I just imagine it starts eating you up from the inside at one point to be to be managing
Right.
this many houses and this many hoes in your life. But yeah, going back to this, so yeah, while the masses need homes, and decade by decade they make less in real terms, so they need to take on debt more than previous generations.
Yeah, I think there is something to be said about that,
Yeah.
but I've heard Stefan Molyneux mention this once, is that if you look at previous generations, we try to buy homes that are like 2 or 3 times as big. Like you hear about your dad or your grandpa, like, yeah, we grew up in a 3-bedroom home with 10 kids, and we all just kind of slept in bunk beds in the one room, and versus I want a 4-bedroom, 3-bathroom house as my first house, and I'm sad because I can't afford it.
Yeah,
Right.
and also, so another aspect to what Ronora is saying here is that if the government starts making austerity policies, then that would incline the private sector to borrow more.
Correct.
That is a fact that's been established. If the government starts cutting down on deficit spending, raising taxes, etc., then private debt will rise as a consequence, and the financial system becomes unstable as a result. So the thing is here, this is a very long period, right? So there have been periods of expansion, austerity throughout all of this. So, but I think that there may be some truth to that, because we had some serious austerity. You also see that during the 90s, there was this sort of mild increase, but then I think 96, 97, the debt over income really started going up. And this was a period of austerity. This was the Clinton years, the budget surplus years, right?
Mm-hmm.
When people started fantasizing about the US government paying off the entire federal debt. And oh my God, how great are we doing? The Goldilocks years. And that period kind of really only ended in the Trump era, in my opinion. We've had this big blow up. We've had this consolidation, and then we've had in the Trump era beginning a time of pretty severe deficit spending, etc. And that mentality has kind of lasted until this day. So that could be a partial reason as to how this has leveled off so much. Again, I'm not counting this bump here really.
Well, and then we've discussed this in previous shows, to Ronoa's point here, because even though I offered a counterpoint, I do agree that he's bringing something up here, is that if we look at the entire system and what's the purpose of money and who should be getting it, right? If we understand that the purpose of money is a tax token, here, you want to unshare your screen so we can see both of us. If the purpose of money is a tax token, and you're going to demand the tax from people, and then you're going to expect the economy to take that money, what's left over, and utilize it to create a market, you have to say, okay, how are we injecting this money in the first place? What's the purpose of injecting this money? And from our MMT standpoint, our argument is the purpose of injecting this money is to reach full employment. Well, apparently the Federal Reserve was created for that purpose, and then on day 2, it immediately changed its mind and said, no, the Federal Reserve is supposed to control inflation, and we're going to do that by having a certain amount of people unemployed, so there's always a pool to draw from, right? So if we could recognize that this money, and I'm not saying that there shouldn't be injections from the top for federal contracts and stuff, but fundamentally there needs to be injection from the bottom, which we've talked about not ad nauseum, but at some point it's going to be ad nauseum, that a federal transition job is kind of the only thing that fits that bill to make sure that the bottom rung gets that money injection, and particularly not that money injection is different from credit, from private credit, like we were looking at on that chart. That's money that doesn't have to be paid back. That's the private sector net savings that the government creates, right?
And, and I would also add that this whole period that we just looked at, it was accompanied by ever more innovation in the realm of finance and financing, and also more and more lending for the purposes of financial speculation instead of building.
This will segue us into Professor Richard Werner. Keep going.
Yeah. But yeah, so these may all be reasons as to why leverage has gone up over this period. Now, the question, like I said, is there a correct leverage ratio? Hard to say. But what we can say is, in relative terms, we are far better in terms of leverage in this country today than we were in 2008. And we seem to be at a level that's pretty sustainable. However, of course, if there's austerity, if there's issues with the debt ceiling, if there aren't resolved, if there's an austerity deal of some kind, taxes are raised, spending's cut, then we may actually see this this leverage increase again for a time. Until then, it hits another wall, and we have another financial crisis. Now, there's some more comments here from Ronora. There's hidden austerity in the debasement of the currency and real changes in mode of production in the 20th century. So yeah, the debasement of the currency, aka inflation,
kind of.
That's problematic. That's a difficult one, because there's people who benefit from the inflation and there's people who are hurt by it. So Carol Quigley has written about the tragedy and hope as a general simplistic rule. Industry and farming benefits from inflation, and banking loses out from the inflation because they depend on fixed income. So to say that in aggregate that the so-called debasement of the currency or inflation is a form of austerity is not necessarily true, in my opinion. It may be true in the situations where the rise in prices results from commodity price increases that people in this country have to pay to people outside of the country. As was the case, for example, in the 1970s, the US was not energy independent yet, and as is the case, by the way, right now in countries like Germany and in Europe in general. They are having to pay a much higher prices for oil and gas, and that money is in effect leaving that economy. It's not staying within the economy. In the United States, when oil prices go up, then that means that oil companies do better, means oil drillers do better, it means all kinds of people that constitute a significant segment of the US economy earn more money. So yeah, I wouldn't necessarily equate that with austerity. I'm not saying that it's good for these trends to occur. I'm also not necessarily saying it's bad, but price changes are a fact of a capitalist economy, and we can't necessarily. It's an arbitrary goal, in my opinion, to aim for price stability. And also
on the flip side of that, before we get to the next comment, is if we look on the other side and we say, okay, what happens during deflation? There's winners and losers in deflation too. And I think to the point that Quigley makes is that typically when you see deflation, it's the lower people that get hurt the worst when it comes to deflation, right? I mean, I understand that the libertarian or the Austrian argument that inflation erodes savings. Well, first you got to assume that there's any savings to erode, which we know that's a common problem in the United States right now. And second, I've heard Warren Mosler point this out, the founder of MMT, is that we've got all sorts of vehicles, investment vehicles, to protect people against inflation. Right? The most simplest one is we got bonds, right?
Yeah, I keep talking about that, actually. That
the permanent portfolio. Yeah.
Right, and it also, inflation doesn't necessarily erode savings, because savings sit in an account that earns interest and compounding interest. And when inflation goes up, the Federal Reserve starts raising interest rates, which makes up for some of the losses, maybe sometimes more than the losses. Right now, for example, you earn about 5% on your savings account. Actually, I think 4%. And by the way, I think that number has been coming down. Inflation is coming down. The most recent reading was like 4.8% or so.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, those were considered pretty normal rates.
Is he still going?
Yeah, I'm just. We'll get to all those good points. All good points. But those were considered kind of normal rates in the 90s, I think. But so yeah, we have a 4.8% inflation rate. You earn about 4.8% on a money market mutual fund or some savings accounts as well, over 4% certainly. So there's, to some extent, even the simplest form of saving your money, you get compensated for inflation to some extent. Not always, but by and large, there's some sort of compensatory effect. Couple that with an intelligent portfolio strategy, like the permanent portfolio, where you also have gold in your portfolio. You also have stocks in your portfolio. Stocks tend to benefit from inflation, by the way. Just inflation itself. Stocks are hurt by the government's efforts to fight inflation, which by that they mean raising the interest rates, because that reduces the net present value of any financial asset. But generally speaking, you have the ability to protect your savings against inflation. That's the very reason why we put our money in assets, right? So they retain and gain some value.
Next comment.
But also what Renora said, real changes in the mode of production of the 20th century is also a form of hidden austerity. I don't know if that refers to AI and automation, that kind of stuff.
He said 20th, not 21st.
Oh yeah, and real changes 20th century. I don't know, but
yeah, I mean,
do you have any thoughts?
I need a more specific comment to really real changes like what?
I mean, the big trend in the 20th century has obviously been the extension of the technocracy, essentially, right? The extension of the industrial age and an industrial super state overseeing the whole thing, the New Deal and all those things, big, massive projects. That's been the trend of the 20th century. That in and of itself, I don't know if I would necessarily call that austerity. But at the end of the day, if there's a trend towards AI and automation, and the government does austerity policy, actual austerity policies, then I think that can lead to austerity. But I mean, I think it does require some financial austerity on the part of the government, because then you have a bunch of people unemployed and no new money coming in for employing those people, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is why I disagree with MMT. MMT is a valid theory of price, but not value.
I don't think MMT ever purports to have a valid theory of value or try to identify value.
Right. So
in fact, let me rant a little bit. This is one of the reasons I find it so refreshing, is that with MMT we could make a description over the economy that appears to be at some level accurate without fighting over what exactly does value mean. Is there such a thing as intrinsic value? Or I only value it if I'm not forced to do it, right? I don't value money because the government forces me to take it. That's not real. Like we don't have to get into any of that.
True.
Right?
It's true. The Austrian theory of value is basically that the individual assigns different priorities to different things, and in an open exchange on the marketplace among individuals, a price emerges, and the price reflects the individual value judgments. That's the atomistic Enlightenment view of economics, the Adam Smith, the Ludwig von Mises view of economics that emerges from individual value. And I have no beef with the theory that people have different priorities. Like I find a luxury condo in Miami better than a shack in San Francisco. So this ordinal scale.
Anybody catch Nima's jab at San Francisco there? Sorry, continue.
So I don't disagree with that, but then the idea that the market prices, or what we see as price on the market, emerge out of that, I find to be a bit of a leap. And MMT is a little more empirical when it comes to prices. And he also says, Ronora said here, valid theory of price, because MMTers in their literature, when they talk about price, they say that, first of all, there's no evidence that prices are market clearing, right? There's no evidence that there's these supply and demand curves that, I don't know, David Ricardo and Adam Smith and these people came up with, and that the price just clears that, brings that supply and demand into perfect harmony. These are all mathematical musings and theories, but what MMTers say in practice is that a price is a tool to accumulate surpluses. And I think Randy Ray wrote this in one of his papers on inflation. He says, so the free market radical thinks of prices as a market clearing phenomenon that just clears the market, brings supply and demand in harmony. The MMTer says that to understand prices, think more of a colonial governor who starts up a new colony and needs to accumulate surpluses in his direction to then start doing investment projects and these kinds, because that's what you need, surpluses to put people into lines of business where they don't produce consumer goods, or they produce infrastructure goods, investment goods, etc. So I think I found that MMT approach to price is pretty level-headed and empirical, and so yeah, I do agree with them on that. We don't live under capitalist mode. Well, capitalism.
I don't even know what it is anymore.
Well, we define capitalism. Generally, I like Carol Quigley's definition of capitalism, which is a
pursuit of profit within a price structure.
Individual pursuit of profit in a price structure. So we try to increase monetary inflows to ourselves and or maximize inflows, minimize outflows. You have the ability in this country to start a business, to compete, et cetera. So I would say we do have capitalism in that sense. You know, I don't like to, because if we have some impossible expectation of the term capitalism, okay, then we never have capitalism. Then the discussion is also, the word is completely useless and meaningless. But I do think that we certainly live in a capitalist system by that definition that I just stated. But of course, a capitalist system that suffers from heavy government intervention. No doubt about it.
Well, so and then let's talk about instruments and institutions, because I think this last comment he brought up is very, or that penultimate comment at this point, he brought up really can bring this to light. So Rowanora says, if you start a company today, what is your path to making the most money the fastest? Is it being mindful of capitalists trying to make the most profit, or is it leveraging share capital, i.e. going public? Well, it's the latter, particularly, but you have to add mergers and acquisitions. So this is the path that I'm working on, which is you acquire businesses. Instead of starting your own business, that takes too long. You buy somebody else's business, you buy a bunch of them, get a massive business, then turn around and make that go public, and then you can feed yourself all this money. Now, Rowanora says, the mode of production itself has changed. This is what MMT misses. So I'm not sure if this is what MMT misses, or if you've just described an instrument becoming institutionalized, right? Because if we have this societal instrument, an economic societal instrument, or in the case of Western civilization, this is the instrument of expansion, which more or less defines Western civilization, which is we have capitalism, which is pursuit of profit within a price structure. I don't know if you've listened to our Evolution of Civilization series that we did, however far back we did it. Nima looks like he's pulling it up here. Is we go over that at least Quigley, before he dies in the 70s and doesn't have time to talk about the modern era, talks about 3 separate times that this has grown and died within Western civilization, where you have a capitalistic structure that focuses on creating more goods and services. You make more money by creating more goods and services, and then at some point you get so creative that things get so cheap that the people in power aren't making as much money anymore, and they realize, hey, we can make more money if we restrict goods and services. Now, under the definition of capitalism that we've given, which is pursuit of profit within a price structure, those are both capitalism. However, the initial goal of the instrument, which is to produce goods and services cheaper for everybody, becomes turned on its head to serve a vested interest, which is, okay, we're going to restrict the flow of goods and services to raise prices so we can put more money into our pocket. Now, if we take that into the future now, which is what Ronora has pointed out here, which is to say, okay, do you get rewarded more by creating more goods and services, or do you get rewarded more by playing this stupid stock market game where you could go public and suck up all this money that had nothing to do with the fact that you created a better service or created more better goods? I think that's totally a valid point. And I would make the argument that is a perfect example of an instrument becoming an institution. But I also don't if I put my MMT hat on, I would say, of course, if you have the banking system not regulated properly to stop generating money for the purposes of asset speculation, it's going to generate those funds for asset speculation, which in turn is going to go into the stock market, which means there's more money flush to say, okay, hey, we want to invest in something. What's the initial public offering today that we could throw our money at? Right? I think MMT describes that perfectly.
And MMT, and also there's a relevant quote.
Switch back to us.
Yeah. On that topic, there's a relevant quote in the book on Minsky. Just going to read it real quick. Minsky said this in 1987. Securitization reflects a change in the weight of. So first of all, you know what securitization is?
Possibly. Tell me what sense you're referring to.
Well, securitization means that you create a security out of an income stream.
Okay.
Right. Like the ridiculous example would be Dylan makes a certain income, and you create a security that's called Dylan Inc. and you sell it to me at a price, and now you owe me all your income.
I owe you a dividend that I'm supposedly able to afford by the fact I'm doing this thing that's generating income, right?
Right.
Yeah, and so then you can turn around and sell that security to somebody else.
Yeah.
Or split it up into 1,000 shares or whatever. Yeah.
Exactly. And that's what he also gets into. But this quote here, securitization reflects a change in the weight of market and banking funding capabilities. Market funding capabilities have increased relative to the funding abilities of banks and depository financial intermediaries. It is in part a laggard response to monetarism. The fighting of inflation by constraining monetary growth opened opportunities for non-banking financing techniques. So this whole trend of nowadays, we'd rather issue common stock, make a quick buck. These are workarounds by the private sector around a financial system that has been trying to clamp down on credit per se over time more and more. It just makes credit, considers credit a bad thing per se. And these are things like raising interest rates and stuff like that. These drive private market actors towards innovation. And also, this is another part of Minsky's literature. He talks a lot about innovation. He says, whatever the regulators do, there will be innovations in the private sector that will innovate around it and then go to the legislators and make the case that, hey, look, this is going on anyway, so these regulations are all dumb, you need to get rid of them. And he also writes about, I just saw this part earlier, the problem with the securitization when it came to, for example, mortgage loans in the lead up to the financial crisis. There's a mismatch between the profit that the issuer of a mortgage loan makes and the risk that he assumes in the long term if he can just securitize those loans and offload them with the Federal Reserve. Actually, and so the Federal Reserve actually purchases mortgage-backed securities to some extent. So if you the proper way of doing it would be a bank makes a 30-year mortgage loan, and then that bank services that loan for the duration of the loan, right? That makes sense because now the bank has a vested interest in making a good loan because they are stuck with it for 30 years. Now, if there's a mortgage lender who makes a loan and can peddle a story about that loan to the next guy and then sell that whole thing to the next guy, the people who made the loan never had to care that much about the long-term viability of that loan.
Yeah, that's
right?
that's an interesting point. So I'm going to loan to you. I know you're probably a credit risk, and let's say I make you a loan at 5%. I turn around to go to the next bank and I say, hey, I'll sell it to you for 2%. I get my 2%, walk away. They now have the credit risk.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You have money in hand, free and clear, and you're free to go. So you are not stuck with the risk anymore. Somebody else. It's kind of like a game of kind of a hot potato situation. But yeah, definitely. I mean, that is a problem. That is a reflection of, in my opinion, an overall a willingness to lie to people, honestly, because when you make money from selling shares, your prime focus is going to be the story about the project. Your focus is not going to be the products that are supposed to be produced, the machinery, the computers.
It's how sexy the story is, yes.
Exactly. And that changes everything. That makes the people who spin the story the most important actors in the process of profit accumulation. And that is exactly what finance capitalism has.
Let me emphasize that, because let's make a little bit of a concrete example out of that, because when I learned how to do what I'm doing, that was literally what I was told, is that you like, forget whatever the fuck you're doing. If you can't spin a story, forget it. You're just not going to make it. And to emphasize this point, if let's say I got an idea. Here's my company. I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. I go to the bank and I do my presentation, and the bank goes, oh yeah, but what about this? What about that? What about this? What about that? No, let us see this and let us see that. And give us your finances, your better. Okay, well, let's do the same exact thing, but Bill Gates is on my team. And I go to the bank and I go, Bill Gates is on my team. What do you think they're gonna do? We don't need to hear anymore. Here's your money. Right?
we gotta get the numbers down.
Yeah. The show's kind of turning into a response to Ro and Aura here, but it's good. These are bringing up good stuff. So slow down, Ro and Aura. We got to back up and
yeah. So we don't live under capitalist mode. Commodity form has been abolished. So if by that he means commodity money, yeah, but it's never really been a thing to begin with. Marx was right. Oh, that's a big statement. The crisis has already happened, and we are living in socialism. Just one in service of the bourgeoisie. Okay, so we're redefining the meaning of the word socialism. Yeah, in that case, I guess. I mean, we are living under a regime that has been set up by what's called Fabian socialists, right? The Milner Group, the Quigley gang, not the Quigley gang, the Cecil Rhodes.
Cecil Rhodes gang, yeah.
They were Fabian socialists, and they saw the path towards socialism as a war of attrition over time. That's why it's called Fabian, because it was a strategy of the Roman general Fabius Maximus, I think was his name, was not to fight the enemy head on, but to sabotage them slowly over time. So that's the strategy of Fabian socialism. And it is basically, I would say, it is actually monopoly capitalism is what that means, you know. And yet Marx was not opposed to monopoly capitalism necessarily. He said that that would be
I mean, that's what the state is. Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Right.
the state. That was a stage towards the final nirvana of a stateless communist society.
I want to address this next comment he made here. So Rowanor says the specific problem here is MMT as a description does not have in its purview the real economy that is material surplus. I don't know what your MMT stuff you're reading, but my understanding of MMT is that that's their primary concern, and they understand money is what you use to maneuver that sort of stuff, and that you're constrained by real resources. You're not constrained by money. You're not constrained by your ability to type numbers or print pieces of paper with numbers written on them. So instead of looking at, oh my God, we don't have enough numbers on the screen, we need to go, oh my God, what are the actual real resources that we have access to, and utilize the money to appropriately utilize those resources.
Yes.
So I'm not sure where you're getting your information there, Rowan Ora.
MMT economists stress this all the time. What matters is the real economy, not the financial economy. So if in the real economy we have a situation where we have an underutilization of industry capacity, then deficit spending and all these things, if they are done in a way that is equitable and goes, like Dylan said, bottom up, kind of like a job guarantee, for example, then that does not have to lead to inflation. Now, of course, if we launch or facilitate a war in the Ukraine that makes oil prices spike, muck up the supply chain, come up with all kinds of stupid ass rules, start crippling and killing people with mandatory gene drug injections. I mean, I'm saying if, I'm not saying that that is happening, right? Because the COVID jabs are obviously working fantastically. But if that were the case, then yeah, you're going to produce an inflationary scenario. So if you have that situation where you have a total industry capacity utilization, MMT recognizes too that injecting more money will lead to inflation because real resources have to be bid up by the extra money. It's not necessarily controversial in MMT circles. Our material standards. So he says the real economy has been shrinking since 2001.
Maybe.
How do you? Yeah, the question is how do you quantify that objectively? Hard to quantify objectively. I mean, I don't know if that's the case really.
I would argue that doing the traditional, and by I mean traditional, I mean like post World War II, doing the traditional things in your life in order to participate in the economy does not give you the same rewards as it used to. Going to school, getting good grades, and going to college is not the ticket that it used to be. And however, that is still the prescription that you're given as a new human being graduating into economic life.
Yeah, I mean, we have identified by combining Zehan and Quigley this economic super cycle or this expansion cycle of the globalist economy beginning in around 1945 and lasting probably sometime through what did we say? I would say 2015 maybe. But we also identified 2001 with the emergence of September 11th, the emergence of the whole response to September 11th. Yeah, we've identified those as potential markers for an end to that kind of expansionary period in the beginning of what did we call it? The current phase of conflict. I mean that's what we're in, right? I mean, I think it's hard to argue with
Yeah.
But when did it exactly start? Well, I think it got really brutal with September 11th. It started getting really ridiculous with 9/11. We've had stuff in the 90s like Waco and all these atrocities, and obviously foreign wars, etc. But it got really in our faces with 9/11.
Right.
And then it got really even more in our faces with the COVID hysteria. So, yeah, I think you could make the case that that expansion has ended and that we are in a problem phase, in a conflict phase. And we've also laid out a future positive paths as to where this could go, because the conflict phase means that the institutionalized powers, which in this case is basically Fabian socialism, the Milner Block people, and whatever came after that, the Rockefellers, the CFR, the Trilaterals, the Brzezinskis, all these assholes, they are panicking and they are trying to restrict the supply of goods and services, trying to restrict the supply of information, quite frankly. I mean, the internet was an amazing information sharing machine. And if you look at the self-proclaimed elite circles, which are basically decrepit aristocrats and industrialists, they can't shut up about going after people who disagree with them. That seems to be the main focus everywhere now. In science, I mean, the big discussions in science are now, how do we make sure that people only hear
what this group of, in quote, scientists say? Yes.
Only hear corporate pharma's opinions on science, and how do we delete from existence all disagreement? All these things, they are symptoms of a conflict phase. They're symptoms of a restriction of the supply of things from the top, because an expansion in the supply of those things does not benefit those people at the top. Quite the contrary, it hurts them. It challenges their monopolies, their oligarchy, and that